If you read Japanese fashion magazines or follow Japanese fashion influencers, you'll start to pick up on a couple of either British made brands that they like or brands that are obviously Japanese but are evoking some sort of British iconography or even like just a location name. Sometimes there are brands that just say Scotland or something at the bottom. And I've really taken an interest in this fascination with UK culture or just the romanticism behind the idea that clothing has been made in the UK for Japanese people. And in this time of year, the season of the trench coat, I wanted to extend my gracious attention, obviously from a channel that focuses a lot on Japanese Americana, to the influence that British fashion has had on Japan. I really want to take the long view, so we're going to start in the 1500s, talk about how these Western styles arose in Japan, cemented themselves, became popular, and then discuss which brands are popular in Japan today. So in the mid 1500s, the very first Western European power that had any real hold or presence in Japan was the Portuguese. And if you have watched Shogun or read Shogun, then you know all about this because the Portuguese were in Japan trading. They essentially had a monopoly on trade to and from Japan and were making so much money off of it. But in the mix was their interest in spreading Catholicism into the country. Now, if you're like me and watching Shogun for the first time randomly, you'll know that in 1600, a British gentleman made his way to Japan for the first time. To be clear, Shogun is loosely based off of these events. It's not totally accurate, but you get the general idea of what happened. That gentleman's name was William Adams, and he did become an advisor to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was the founder and first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate. It's during this time in the early 1600s that the Japanese are becoming wise to the way the Portuguese want to do business. First come the traders, then the missionaries, and then the colonial rulers and their soldiers. They see it happen in the Philippines, and they don't want it to happen to them. At this point, the British are there, the Dutch are there, and the Portuguese, of course, all have a presence in Japan. I'm trying to do this part of the history quickly because some of you may know it, some of you may not, but I don't have a PhD in this. I actually did study international relations, which I guess gives me some sort of credentials, but I didn't study East Asia. I actually studied Near Eastern languages and civilizations, which is the Middle East. So this is mostly just based off of my research. So the Japanese in 1639 decide they are closing the country off from these foreign influences. They don't want to play around with this anymore. They let some Dutch and some British traders remain, a very, very small amount of people, and in a very, very specific place. So now we're skipping TV shows. Actually, I haven't seen all of Shogun yet, so I don't know where it ends, but we're going to skip TV shows essentially to Blue-Eyed Samurai because, if you're like me and you want to learn history but you want to have a good time doing it, I prefer to read, historical fiction or watch historical fiction, I guess. So, you have some fun, you learn some things. Blue-Eyed Samurai focuses on the fact that there's this one Dutch guy who's doing these trade deals with the Japanese and he's like hidden away and he's very hard to get to, right? So that's sort of what's happening in this era in the late 1600s. The Dutch East India Company had a tiny outpost on the island of Dejima. The British also stayed for a while, tried to make their own trade deal, but it's fizzled out. It was too hard to do, so they left. And so now at this point, and for the next couple of centuries, the Dutch are really the only Western European power that have any sort of presence in Japan. There is some trading of goods, there is some trading of knowledge, and the two countries get along. Sorry, I had a technical error, but now I'm back and I have tea with milk and sugar, so we're very on theme here. So, what we're talking about? Okay, so the Dutch are in Japan. They're the only European power in Japan. I think this period is interesting because it is sort of indicative of how Japan will react to foreign goods and knowledge and science and technology in a couple of centuries when they open up to the entire world, right? All the Dutch stuff that they're getting, it's like new and exciting, it's exotic. It's also because it's imported goods, there's low supply, there's high demand among the elite. And they also, in the later half of the 18th century, they have this movement called Rangaku, which is essentially a broader interest in Dutch learning. Because at that point, again, really the only access they have to foreign knowledge is from China. So for them, that Dutch scientific knowledge and philosophy was an alternative path for them, and the only alternative path they had, that they had access to. Okay, so that's the Dutch period in Japan. In 1853, this whole thing blows wide open. This American Commodore, Matthew Perry, goes to Japan and he has been instructed to open up trade relations with Japan by any means necessary, using force if they have to. And it takes about 5 years, but they get it done. And so, right after, all these European powers are like, us too, us too. They slide in right after. And Britain, in 1858, opens up trade relations with Japan as well, and they have a diplomatic mission there, and so they have sort of normalized relations. So then there are only a couple of years between those events and the start of the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is very famous in terms of Japanese history. It's this period of extremely fast modernization and opening to the outside world for Japanese society. And part of the impetus or even the construction of what happens during the Meiji Restoration starts with these five guys, five Japanese guys. They are in connection with a British gentleman who was in Japan at the time, the late 1850s, early 1860s. And he has a friend, a Japanese friend, and essentially they're all like, we want to go to London, we want to go to England, and we want to learn all there is to learn. Now that we have this more open relationship, we want to go to Britain. So he sort of smuggles them out of the country because it's still, things are still tenuous and tense, and he takes them out of the country, and they go and they study at university in Britain. They study at the University College London. And these guys go on to become, during the Meiji Restoration, real advocates essentially for British norms, for British technologies and British governmental systems, all these things. So these guys who go and study in university in Britain really do make a great impact during the Meiji Restoration. So in 1868, the Emperor Meiji makes this proclamation. He says, "The Emperor of Japan announces to the sovereigns of all foreign countries and their subjects that permission has been granted to the shogun to return the governing powers in accordance with his own request. We shall henceforth exercise supreme authority in all the internal and external affairs of the country. It is desirable that the representatives of the treaty powers recognize this announcement." A couple of things about this letter. First of all, it does feel very Japanese. For the emperor, essentially what the emperor is doing is like a power grab. For years, the emperor in Japan, though apparently an unbroken line of almost like divine leadership, has existed as a symbolic figurehead, and the country is actually being run by the shogun. And so the emperor is essentially taking back control and saying, no, as the emperor, I will rule. It is my country, it's my empire, and we're doing away with the shogun, the shogunate structure. But we haven't really got to the fashion part of the story yet. So for me, I really like fashion as a lens to look into history, to look into current events, past events, and I think a really interesting thing about this period, the Meiji Restoration, is that it seems like the Japanese are realizing that they can't hide anymore and they have to enter the world stage. And when they enter the world stage, what they see obviously is that there are these colonial European empires that are trading, they are dealing in riches, they are taking control of countries. And I think the Japanese, rightfully so, after now many centuries of dealing with these European countries, they think it's eat or be eaten. And so they go through this period where they're learning from these other countries and they're thinking, we're going to be an empire. It's especially, I think it's so symbolic that the emperor sort of takes power at this point and Japan becomes an empire and grows its empire essentially until World War II. Now, as Japan, I think, decides to become this world power because they want to be on equal footing with these European powers, especially during these early trade treaties, Japan feels like they've been sort of shafted. They feel like these treaties were unequal, that they were sort of forced to agree to them, and so they really work hard to sort of figure out the game so that they can renegotiate these treaties on more proper terms. So again, it's 1868. The emperor makes this announcement, like, I'm taking back power. I am the real seat of power, and I will yield it, not the shogun. And this British gentleman, Sir Harry Parkes, he's the head of the British legation, presents his credentials to the emperor, making him the first of the Western powers to sort of recognize this new regime. And Emperor Meiji also announces knowledge shall be sought all over the world, and thereby the foundation of imperial rule shall be strengthened. So that's what I was just talking about, right? He's like, okay, you guys are empires, we'll be an empire, and then we can all play the same game because I won't be left out if this is the way you guys are going to play it. And then, like I said, there are people who have gone abroad to study and learn. There are people who are coming to Japan to teach and explore. And there's all this, cross cultural mixing. And so during the Meiji period, during this modernization, they put into place a lot of things that are directly influenced or directly taken from European powers. So they start adopting all these new systems. They changed their banking system, which for a while was sort of based off of rice, I think, like bags of rice, and I just don't think it was normalized. So they create a new banking system, they implement it. The banking system, I believe, is based off of the British banking system. They changed their navy, very much heavily inspired by the British Navy. They changed their army. Their army is inspired by the German army. They start changing their education system. The education system is largely inspired by the French. So they're changing all these things about Japan very, very quickly. They set up a modern postal system. They set up telegraph lines. They start putting railroads, the very iconic and wonderful Japanese railroad system starts during this period and is heavily influenced and inspired. And I think the British come and also help them. Like, I think the British send engineers to help them with the railways. And essentially, it works. They renegotiate some treaties in the very early 1900s. In 1902, the Anglo-Japanese alliance is concluded, and they feel like they are on a much more even playing ground with these European powers. So let's talk about the style during this time, because Japan obviously has a very unique and rich cultural history around its clothing and its textiles, just like any other country. So the first thing that happens is obviously implemented through uniforms. Like I said, the Navy and the Army start using Western uniforms. Particularly the Navy, I think, is based off of British or French uniforms. I don't know how dissimilar they were at the time. What any military wears is super important fashion-wise. I just can tell because the amount of clothing we wear, especially in menswear, that has military origins is huge. And also just because of military surplus, right? The amount of times that the military makes clothing and then has too much of it and then just sells it back to the populace and then it can become fashionable. This happens in any country with any military. So that is, I think, the first big way that Western clothing gets introduced into Japan. And then they implement it into workwear. So government workers, postal workers, railroad workers, I think policemen, they're all required to wear Western style clothing or suits at the time. And this is the 1870s when they start doing that. And then finally, it's also implemented into formal settings. So the emperor mandates people to dress in Western clothing in 1872 for men and 1886 for women. However, the thing to keep in mind is that our clothing is such our clothing is so important to us. You can't just tell a bunch of people, okay, now you're wearing pants and a suit jacket and it has buttons and it's shaped like this and it fits you like this, because people's entire environments, especially at that point, are made around their clothing, or their clothing is made around their environments. So think about the way the Japanese sleep, the way the Japanese sit, where they work, how they move, what they carry, like everything in their lives coexists with their clothing. So it's much harder to sit on the ground in Western pants than it is in a kimono or a haori or a hakama. And so a lot of times you had this sort of split where people who had to wear uniforms or they had to wear things to go to work, they would wear them at their work, they would sit in Western chairs at work, and then they would go home and get changed, and they would still wear traditional clothing in their personal lives, in their homes, because that's what makes sense for that context. And so as much as Western clothing was introduced at the time, it was a little superficial. Only very specific people were wearing it, and they were only really wearing it at very specific times. In fact, we have this diary called An American Girl in Japan. It was written from 1875 to 1884 by an American teenager, Clara Whitney, and she's talking about how essentially fun. I mean, she's a teenager. She thinks it's funny the way the Japanese wear Western clothing because they're not wearing it correctly. She's like, they look uncomfortable, their cuffs aren't done, they don't have the right tie, they're not wearing suspenders, like there's too much room between their shirt and their pants, like it's a mess to her. And she even says, she's like, they just look better in their own clothing, like they look more at ease with it, it's not confusing to them, they know how to move in their own clothing. And so she has this interesting perspective on this sort of inflection point of how fashion is changing, but it's not changing super successfully, especially in these scenarios where it's being imposed on people. You know, it's not happening necessarily completely naturally. There are some things during that time that really did take off. The common Japanese man does possess three elements of Western fashion: a haircut, a hat, and an umbrella. And the reason is, well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, the emperor at this point was like, cut off your top knots. We're not doing top knots anymore. And Japanese men had been wearing top knots for a very long time. And it's also relatively cheap and easy to get a haircut. Like if you just cut off your top knot, you just have short hair, and that's it. That's all you really need to do. You don't have to buy any textiles. You don't know how to, you don't have to like, wear anything that doesn't fit you. You just have to cut your hair. A hat, which once you cut off your top knot, a hat is a relatively easy thing to wear. Fits a lot of people. You don't need to get it tailored. So you'll see a lot of images from this time period of people wearing entirely traditional Japanese outfits and a hat, a bowler hat, a top hat, maybe, just like different kinds of Western hats. It's just such a funny period of time where they're making this transition and they're like, okay, hats are easy, hats we can do. And so a lot of them wear hats. In terms of more specific British influence, there was this coat. It was called the Inverness coat. That's the style of coat, but the Japanese called it a tonbi or manteau. Manteau is French for coat. Actually, funnily enough, I'm Persian, and there was also a lot of French influence in Iran, actually during this time. And so they also have a piece of clothing called a manteau. Anyway, so it's sort of like a cloak. It's short and it's wide and it's easy again to put over traditional clothing. I think some of the most interesting parts of this, which lend to what's popular today in fashion, in UK inspired fashion in Japan, is that these are made out of wool, usually. Sheep are not native to Japan, so most of the clothing in Japan, I think up until this point, was made of hemp or cotton. I think they were importing silk, things that were nearby or from the country itself. So they started importing wool, which was expensive, and also using items made of wool, which to my mind is a very, Scottish, obviously Scotland is really known for its wool, but UK in general, sort of material. But these coats were really popular because they were versatile. They went right on top. They could be worn with Western clothing or with Japanese clothing. A couple more notes about the fashion in this period. Women were not getting into Western clothing as much as men were. I think there are a couple of reasons for this that I've either read or surmised. One is obviously a lot of the jobs I talked about: government workers, railroad workers, military. Women aren't in those roles, so they don't really have that exposure. They don't really need to be wearing Western clothing in those contexts. Women also, like I said, they were not required to wear Western clothing in court until much later than men. And I think just in general, I've had this conversation before because I talked about this. Oh, when I went to Guatemala. When I went to Guatemala, I noticed a lot of the women wore more traditional clothing and almost all the men wore Western clothing or like American, not their traditional clothing. And I was sort of having a discussion online about it, and a lot of people said women just in general they're expected to like hold on to tradition. They're sort of like the keepers of culture sometimes in different societies, and there's sort of this expectation that women will take that role. So like men can go through modernization and men can go out and travel and get these jobs and change things, but someone needs to keep the tradition going, and who's going to do that? It's the women. It's the women who often make the clothes, it's the women who mend the clothes, it's the women who teach the children. So sometimes women in society are just sort of expected to keep traditions alive, and so they may modernize their clothing less. Another thing, obviously, to mention is that Western clothing was really, at this point, something for the elite. It was something that people who had a lot of money could get their hands on because, of course, it's imported. You might need a tailor who knows how to deal with Western clothing. It's a hard thing for the general populace to understand, to get their hands on. And furthermore, it's something that was happening in urban spaces, particularly. Most rural populations were not wearing any sort of Western clothing, had no exposure to it, had no interest in it. And finally, there was also cross contamination. Of course, in Europe at the time, it was very fashionable to get your hands on Japanese fabrics, Japanese plates, porcelain, chinoiserie. There was this real interest in Eastern Asia, and it was very fashionable and it was very interesting. And of course, famously, Van Gogh, his art style was inspired by East Asian art, and it was huge at the time. I believe it was called Japonism. So it was big in France, it was big in Britain, and these things do not go one way. They go both ways. I'm going to kind of speed through the next 100 years, but let's just say this happened gradually. This didn't happen all at once or with great ease. There were periods of rejection. There were nativist trends where people didn't want to go through this westernized modernization. They didn't want to wear this clothing. And then there were periods of fast adoption, and all sorts of different, fashion styles came and went. Okay, so I'm going to skip to post World War II, essentially talking about modern era Japan. There are a couple of ways that UK fashion and style has maintained its presence in the country. It's funny, obviously, this whole thing started with trade, right? And what is clothing sales if not trade, right? Especially from foreign countries. So there are imported British brands and there are licensed British brands. And I want to talk about both because they're obviously different. I think a great way to sort of explore this idea is to talk about Burberry. Burberry is an extremely iconic British brand, most known for its trench coats, and so we are back to trench coats. Burberry was founded by Thomas Burberry in 1856 in London, so very much around the time that Japan was opening up to foreign trade. And Sanyo Shokai started importing Burberry coats to Japan in 1865. Like I said, we are post World War II. But by 1970, they partnered with the Mitsui Trading Company to make their own apparel under the Burberry name. So they licensed the Burberry name and they make their own clothing under that name for the Japanese market. Now, there is definitely a thirst in Japan for British made clothing. I think the same connotations that we have around things that are made in Japan, the Japanese have for things that are made in the UK. So, this idea of a long heritage of family owned companies, of high quality goods, that's what the Japanese want, that's what they value, and that's what they think they can get from British goods. Now, funnily enough, when a lot of these brands are licensed, they are no longer made in the UK, but they maintain that same sort of allure. So the Japanese can make them at home, they can make them in China, and then sell them to their Japanese market with that same sort of British appeal. For UK brands, I assume it's a good deal because they feel like, they don't speak the language, they don't know the retailers, they don't know the market, they don't know the style that people may want in that country. And so, licensing can be beneficial for both parties. Licensing also sometimes happens when a brand needs cash. I used to work for Marvel, and there were a lot of things that Marvel had licensed out before I joined the company when times were rough that they were then trying to sort of reclaim by the time that I was there during Endgame. So, like the Sony, also if you go to Universal, there are Marvel rides there. That's because they allowed Universal to like buy the licenses to make those rides. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting history around different brands and their licenses and how it all can go awry. In the 70s, there were a lot of licenses sold for high fashion brands. Gucci, I think, is famous, Dior. Now, the issues that arrive is that sometimes it you allow people to sort of make your product with whatever quality and style that they think is appropriate for their market. And so there can be lowered quality and you can essentially mess up your brand image when you license. And Burberry was having the same issue, so there was this disconnect between what Burberry was making and selling in the UK and elsewhere and what this Japanese company was selling under the Burberry name. However, it was very successful in Japan. They have the blue label and the black label. I believe the blue label was for women and the black label was for men, and they were doing great sales. So neither company really had a lot to complain about. But in the 1990s, a lot of companies were trying to buy back their licenses or terminate their license agreements. Burberry bought back their license from China in 2010, I think, for 70 million. And then in 2015, it terminated its licensing in Japan, which I believe was meant to terminate in 2020, and they said they wanted to end it earlier. There was a little bit of a tough transition, so Burberry especially had to let go of all the stores that this other company and businessman were operating and had to open its own. And Burberry actually has been sort of in the fashion news recently. The creative director, Daniel Lee, started in 2022. And I've heard, I mean, the general consensus that I've seen is that Burberry is too expensive and their sales are suffering because of that. And they need to think about their pricing. The manufacturers that were making and selling Burberry in Japan essentially pivoted, and they now have these companies. Macintosh, there's Macintosh London, Macintosh Philosophy, and then there's Crestbridge Blue Label and Crestbridge Black Label. So the things to focus on here are obviously that they have still this UK branding, even though at this point, like, they really don't have that much to do with the UK. They want to evoke that UK style, that fact, this heritage, this quality, this idea that, these things come from a British heritage. And we don't use Macintosh much in America, but the Macintosh is the jacket. It's called the Mac or the Macintosh. And so, yeah, they're using these words: Macintosh London, Crestbridge, which, has that sort of UK vibe. The other companies that I've seen that do a similar thing, where they're either licensed or they're sort of pretending to be British, but they're not. It's sort of hard for me to tell, to be honest. But these are the brands I see Japanese people wearing and really like, and I think they're probably good clothing. So these are some brands that I've seen like in Popeye or on some influencers, and I think they're cute stuff, but it's just funny to go on these websites and see like very British iconography, or like this company is called Traditional Weatherwear. It says Scotland, it has a Union Jack, and then it says Cumbernauld Glasgow, but I think it's just a Japanese company. Like, I don't, are they even pretending it's actually made in Glasgow? I need to translate this. It says Traditional Weatherwear is a brand from the British company Macintosh that started in 1974 with rubberized coats and currently releases collections that focus on outerwear and reflect British traditions and current trends. That's what you'll see a lot of times. It's like it reflects British traditions and current trends. There was some other phrasing that I saw that I liked. What were they calling it? British fashion born in Japan. So that sort of indicates to you what the idea is. Obviously, they're using this sort of UK veneer as a selling point. This is not to say that the clothing is bad. It's just an example of how far this sort of branding can get you and why licensing is so popular. You can sort of essentially license the British heritage, but not actually come through with the actual, quality. It could be good quality made in other places, but I think they're sort of selling the veneer that this is coming from Britain. There are, of course, UK brands that the Japanese really like that are just bought directly and imported from the British. So the first one that I've seen, and I think I've talked about this one before, is Johnston's of Elgin. It's a Scottish knitwear company. And so again, you have in this case, I think, real idea that you're getting this really high quality wool garment. I don't think they've licensed their brand. They are a B corporation, so that sounds good. And yeah, I see them shouted out all the time in Popeye. And then I've also seen Yarmo sold in Japan. I have been able to find their UK website as well, and it says manufacturers of British workwear and uniform for over 100 years. Since 1898, Yarmo have manufactured workwear in Great Yarmouth, Great Britain. So that seems like a great brand. I think Drake's is fairly popular in Japan. John Smedley, I think, is another knitwear company. John Smedley, why does that sound familiar? Yes, it's also a knitwear company. So those two are similar. Again, like, I think the idea that wool is not necessarily native to Japan and you have to go to the UK to get these high quality wools, like, that seems like an ever-present idea. I have talked about Gloverall in the past. A lot of these traditional British outerwear companies, like again Burberry or in this case Gloverall, the Japanese are still interested in buying. And of course, Barbour, another classic British outerwear company. You see a lot of Barbour, I feel like, on older Japanese men. It's like a very kind of suave older gentleman look. The thing I found satisfying about what traditional British clothing is still the most popular in Japan today is that it was the stuff that was originally introduced to them when the country opened up. So it's military clothing, it's workwear, and it's formal wear. You have knitwear, of course. I also talked about the introduction of wool and the wool coats into Japanese society. I think Japanese still have a great admiration for wool from the UK, and I just find that through line super satisfying. So, thank you so much for watching. This video is sort of the culmination of a couple of ideas I've had bouncing around my head. One is licensing. Licensing in Japan is super interesting to me. Licensing in general is interesting to me. And then, of course, I watched Blue Eyed Samurai last year. I started watching Shogun and reading Shogun this year. And it's sort of all just connected in my mind as this long experience between these two countries, trading clothing, trading culture, trading ideas, and things that work, things that haven't, the issues that they've had together, and also eventually, as it seems in this period, this sort of mutual respect for well constructed clothing.